Now, one of the movements that a lot of college students will get involved with is the anti-war movement against Vietnam. So, how do we get to the point where we have a full-blown anti-war movement against American involvement in Vietnam? Where we last left off was talking about the United States adopting a policy of counterinsurgency in Vietnam. So, presidents like John F. Kennedy sending in military advisors to help train the South Vietnamese army to be able to put down this internal rebellion against South Vietnamese rule. However, where Johnson starts to escalate this war is with the Gulf of Tonkin. Okay. Now, Johnson had not been a stranger to expressing support for military involvement. For example, in the Dominican Republic, 22,000 American troops were sent to intervene in a power struggle in Dominican politics, particularly, however, in favor of a more right-wing American-friendly government versus a elected left-wing president who had been overthrown in 1963. Johnson argued that if we did not intervene and prevent the more leftist politician from being elected, that this would turn into another Cuba. But nobody really expected America to get very much more involved in Vietnam. However, in 1964, a incident in the Gulf of Tonkin off of Vietnam between a North Vietnamese boat and an American ship launched Americans into greater involvement in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese boat was accused of firing on an American naval ship, and Congress responded by passing a resolution, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the president the authority to use, and I quote, all necessary measures to repel armed attack, end quote. Now, there will be no formal declaration of war in Vietnam. This is the closest we get to declaring war. And in 2005, declassified documents revealed that the Gulf of Tonkin incident had not, in fact, happened at all. So this incident was fabricated as a way for the United States to justify getting more deeply involved in Vietnam. While the Congress giving this authority to President Johnson had meant that deploying airstrikes and ground troops was recommended, it's not actually until early 1965 that we start to see the escalation of American military involvement in Vietnam following a Viet Cong attack on an American base in South Vietnam. Now, the Vietnam War and American involvement in it escalates very quickly. By 1968, more than 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam, and more bombs were dropped on Vietnam than by all combatants during World War II combined. So American troops are increasingly sent to Vietnam, and this conflict was getting increasingly deadly. The human cost of the war was very great to both sides, both combatants and non-combatants. In an attempt to deprive the enemy Viet Cong of supply lines and resources, the United States deployed tools like napalm and other chemicals which were designed to burn and destroy farmland, villages, and coincidentally also any humans they came in contact with. Probably one of the more famous images associated with the use of napalm is one in which you see Vietnamese civilians fleeing a very fiery background, and one little girl in particular has had her clothes burned entirely off. Napalm did terrible things to people's bodies. One of the frustrations in Vietnam was that it was very difficult, given the guerrilla nature of the war, for American troops to tell friend from foe in Vietnam. And the frustration over this blurring of lines between combatants and non-combatants meant that you had incidents like My Lai happen. So in 1968, in the village of My Lai, American troops launched an attack on unarmed civilians, arguing that these civilians in My Lai and My Kay, had the two neighboring villages, had supported the Viet Cong on scant evidence. Many women were gang raped and mutilated before their death, and somewhere between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians were killed by American troops. This is a war atrocity, again, attack on unarmed civilians. When one of these American soldiers protested this while it was happening and tried to stop it, he was ostracized or singled out for ridicule and reprisal by his fellow troops. And it would take a while before the massacre at My Lai would become more public knowledge, despite the fact that there is an unprecedented amount of recording and televising happening of the Vietnam War. This is probably the first major American conflict in which television plays a big role. There are a lot of news reports coming out of Vietnam nightly. There's not a whole lot of censorship on the part of government in terms of what can be shown on evening news. And for many Americans, this level of media exposure to the Vietnamese War and this very unfiltered coverage of the war contributed to the growing unpopularity of the war. People were shocked and dismayed by this death and destruction, especially once atrocities like My Lai came to light. Americans also were very much aware of the soldiers who were killed or missing in combat because those reports were frequently posted. And for many, there was also the concern of who was fighting in the war. Because if you were a college student, you could get an exemption because there was a draft on. But however, if you were a college student, you were given a pass, you were not drafted. But what this meant is that the people who ended up being drafted and who had to go, who had to enlist, who had no exemptions, were poor people, the working class, and people of color. So they're the ones disproportionately suffering from being drafted, suffering from going to combat, suffering from being wounded or killed. And so there was also this critique as well that this was a war that the people who were fighting in it did not really have that big of a stake in, right? They were kind of fighting a rich man's war. Many protests in the anti-war movement hinge on both the futility of this war, that we're not making adequate progress in Vietnam, and that it was distracting us from domestic issues like, for example, poverty. Martin Luther King Jr. publicly condemned the war starting in 1967, and the very first anti-war protest on a large scale held in Washington, D.C. in 1965 of about 25,000 people was the first indication that there would not be a lot of popular support for the war. Many people, like SDS leader Carl Oglesby, critiqued the involvement of the United States in Vietnam, arguing that this was part of a decolonization process, that our commitment to self-determination should mean that we stay out of Vietnam and its decisions about the future direction of their nation. He critiqued this blind adoption of anti-communist containment policies in the case of Vietnam. Many young men protested the war by burning their draft cards or fleeing to Canada to avoid being drafted into the military. And in one of the biggest anti-war protests in October of 1967, 100,000 people marched into Washington, D.C., eventually marching over to the Pentagon and placing flowers in the gun barrels of the military police troops that were there to instill order in this protest. So Vietnam is going to get worse before it gets better. And if you're one of my students, you will notice that you had posted for you in this week's folder a episode of a documentary series called Vietnam: A Television History. I highly recommend this whole series, which takes a look at the importance of television as a medium in telling the story of the Vietnam War and in shaping American reactions to the Vietnam War. One episode in particular to watch to understand the anti-war movement and how all these different movements of social protests come together in the late 1960s is one of the later episodes titled Homefront USA. You can find it by looking under YouTube for the term Vietnam Television History Homefront USA. It's a very compelling episode. I highly recommend it. It uses a lot of great footage from anti-war protests and other movements in the late 60s to talk about how Vietnam becomes increasingly unpopular as we don't make any progress there and as the body count grows ever higher. We'll focus a little bit more on the late 60s and social movements when we come back next time. Until next time, I'm Dr. S. Mocker.